Welcome, everybody. We are thrilled to kick off our winter Cyber Policy Center seminar series, and I couldn't think of a better person to start it off with than Professor Anu Bradford from Columbia Law School, my former colleague there. We've had her here at Stanford before. She seems to write a giant book every 2 years or so. The previous book was The Brussels Effect, which was looking at all kinds of issues about how Europe regulates the world. Today, I should have brought it up. She'll be talking about digital empires. Want to make sure that people, the millions who are watching on Zoom know that you can get this from Oxford Press, and those in the room, get it over at our bookstore. As I said, Anu Bradford is a professor. She's the Moses Professor at Columbia Law School, a professor of international organization and, of course, law. Teaches all kinds of classes and writes extensively in the area of international relations, comparative governmental regulation, et cetera. As is our tradition here in the Cyber Policy Center, Professor Bradford will talk for about a half an hour or so, and then I'll join her for a conversation up here. And those of you who are on Zoom can just put your questions into the Q&A, and they will magically appear on my cell phone as I speak with her. And those of you in the room can magically raise your hand. There are a few more seats over. Just feel free to come through that way. I'm thrilled to see such a great crowd here today. We were a little worried that our move to this new room might chill participation, but it's a testament both, I think, to our speaker and to this seminar series that we get such a great turnout in these events. So without further ado, Anu Bradford.
Thank you so much, Nate, for the kind invitation. Thank you all for coming. I am thrilled to be giving the talk in particular in the heart of the tech ecosystems that I have been thinking about so much when writing this book. So really look forward to your questions and comments. But let me maybe start with the premise of the book. And the premise is really this observation that I have that we increasingly now have a global consensus that technology needs to be regulated. But there is no global consensus on what that regulation ought to look like. So in digital empires, I argue that there are three primary ways to think about governing technology. There is the American market-driven regulatory model, there is the Chinese state-driven model, and a European, what I call a rights-driven regulatory model. So let me just walk you quickly through the basic understanding that is driving these three different regulatory approaches. So the American market-driven regulatory approach rests on this idea that we really want to maximize innovation, free speech, and that means that the government is assuming only a trivial role, whereas the governance of technology is in practice handed to the tech companies themselves. So it is a very techno-optimist, techno-libertarian view of the digital world. The Chinese have a somewhat different approach. China is very focused in making China a technological superpower, and it is prepared to leverage state resources to attain that goal. But in addition, the Chinese government wants to leverage technology as a tool for censorship and surveillance and propaganda in an effort to retain the political control of the Communist Party and ensure social stability in the nation. So the Europeans are often then portrayed in this debate as being at the mercy of those two other technological superpowers, lacking a robust technology industry of its own. But in the book, I argue that the Europeans are not willing to, nor are they forced to choose between the Chinese digital world and the American digital world. For the Europeans, the Chinese regulatory model is simply too oppressive, whereas the American model is too permissive. So the Europeans have pioneered their own regulatory model and a vision for the digital economy, which is what I call a rights-driven regulatory model. So this is a model that centers on facilitating a human-centric digital transformation where the protection of fundamental rights of individuals, the preservation of democratic structures of the society, and an attainment of a more fair distribution of the benefits of digital transformation takes the center stage. So this has then led the Europeans to regulate the digital economy extensively in the effort of transferring power away from digital giants to individual users, to smaller companies, and to the society at large. So now the question is, why do I call these three jurisdictions digital empires? And I know the empire is a big word and I use it more metaphorically, but I think it is also conceptually helpful for us. It is because none of these three regulatory models are confined to the jurisdictions themselves. Instead, each is actively exporting its respective governance model abroad. But they are exporting each something different. The US is primarily exporting the private power of its tech companies that basically were set free to take over the world, and that is exactly what they have done. So the tech companies from the United States are present in almost all markets around the world. Their products and services are used by billions of people. And that, through their presence then in these third markets, they are also then exporting these techno-libertarian instincts that are built into their products and services. And they are expanding then this American sphere of influence. The Chinese are mainly exporting what I call infrastructure power. The Chinese tech companies are building digital infrastructures, whether it is the telecommunications networks, undersea cables, data centers, smart cities, safe cities, exporting surveillance technologies along this digital Silk Road that reaches across Asia, Africa, Latin America, and even parts of Europe. And that expansion of these digital infrastructures then entrenches the Chinese digital authoritarian model across the global marketplace. So what are the Europeans exporting? Since they don't have many of the leading technologies, but they are an empire of laws. They have the regulations that govern those technologies. And those regulations then get exported and entrenched across the global marketplace through this phenomenon that I have called the Brussels effect. So the EU is one of the largest and wealthiest consumer markets in the world, and there are very few global companies that can afford not to trade in the EU. So as the price for accessing the European market, they need to follow European regulations. That's not surprising. But often it is in their business interest to extend that European regulation across their global production or global compliance because they want to avoid the cost of complying with multiple different regulatory regimes. So simply by conforming their production or conduct to the most stringent set of regulation, which often is the European regulation, then the European regulations, including digital regulations, get exported through these business practices of tech companies around the world. So here is another observation. If the first argument is that also the European Union is an empire, this is not just a digital world where we can focus on the US and China. The second argument is that we are not seeing a decoupling or the kind of splinternet whereby the world would consist of three separate tech ecosystems, because all three empires are contributing a different layer to global digital governance. You have many markets where you have at the same time the US tech companies, Chinese digital infrastructures, and European regulations governing those tech companies and that infrastructure present at the same time. So when you have the three empires in the same market at the same time, you also see conflict. You see collisions. And a lot of what I discuss in the book is really the nature of these different conflicts that are emerging and unfolding in the digital space. And conceptually, I discuss two types of conflicts. One is the set of horizontal conflicts, and the other one is a set of vertical conflicts. So by horizontal conflicts, I mean the conflicts between the digital empires themselves. So the US-China tech war is a prime example of a horizontal conflict that is defining today's digital era. But we also have many regulatory conflicts between the US and the EU. That is another form of horizontal battle that we are observing. But at the same time, the empires are battling one another in these horizontal conflicts. They are engaged in vertical conflicts in their jurisdictions. And those are the conflicts against tech companies that they are trying to govern. And these conflicts can be particularly difficult because they are also intersecting with the horizontal conflicts. So now when the United States is trying to decide whether it's going to, in part, abandon its market-driven model and start regulating technology, its efforts to regulate its tech companies in this vertical battle take place in the shadow of that horizontal battle, which introduces elements of restraint to that vertical battle, because the US can go only so far in restricting its tech companies' businesses because it needs those tech companies. They are the asset of the US in the horizontal battle against China, which means the US is not going to go all out and all the way, deploying antitrust laws, privacy laws, content moderation laws, AI regulation, and so forth. So it is really the intersection of those conflicts that makes these battles costly, but ultimately manageable. The same way that we don't see full decoupling of the US and China tech ecosystems in the horizontal battle. Because again, we need to be mindful of how these companies need access to one another, each other's markets. So let me now move to the question that probably interests many of you most, is what happens in these battles? Who prevails? Who wins the horizontal battle and who wins the vertical battle? And here, without going to a full predictions, I offer some sort of paths that I observe that are more likely than others. So the first prediction that I make is that the US model is losing. The world is increasingly convinced that the market-driven regulatory model is no longer fit to govern the challenges of today's digital economy. These tech companies have failed us repeatedly. They have done so spectacularly to the extent that few anymore believe that regulation can be left for them to manage. So there's now increasingly, even in the United States, the kind of thinking that, look, we do need rules. We do need government to step in. So ultimately, this techno-libertarian faith in technology, companies enhancing a robust form of democracy, that has not exactly proven to be true. The concentration of digital markets has ensured that not even really free and competitive. This is not what this initial idea of economic freedoms or political freedoms necessarily look like. So if you look at just public opinion in the US, there's much more appetite for regulation. If you look at, there are multiple bills pending in Congress seeking to introduce regulation. It is the dysfunction of the Congress and the polarization that prevents or has thus far prevented those legislative initiatives to really amount to much. But you do see a very different posture in the US, whether it is the executive order in AI, the various cases that the FTC and DOJ are bringing in the antitrust domain against the tech giants. Even the US no longer truly believes in the market-driven model. So if the US market-driven model is losing the ideological battle, at least, that is in many ways good news for the European rights-driven regulatory model, because the governments, in particular, in democratic countries, are increasingly aligning themselves with a variant of the European rights-driven model. So there are many countries that are preparing legislation that resemble the kind of legislation that the European Union has already pioneered. But I see potentially three problems or concerns with the sort of tentative victory of the Europeans in the ideological battle. Some of them are, I think, more concerning than others. So the first concern one might have is that if the European model is doing well, does that mean that we are no longer going to see that much innovation? because there are genuine questions whether the European rights-driven model is consistent. Asking the question, is it because you regulate so much? There are many, if I ask them to name a European tech company, it takes them a while. But they don't miss a beat to be able to name the GDPR. So Europe is more famous for its regulation. So that is potentially a concern also for the US when contemplating whether to move away from the market-driven model to the rights-driven model. Does that mean that there's going to be an inevitable trade-off which comes with fewer innovative technologies? And here I want to argue against the idea that somehow Europe's inability to compete with the US and China on technology could be traced to its extensive commitment to digital regulation. I am very worried about the state of European tech innovations, but I don't think the GDPR is the problem. If we scrap the GDPR next year, and if we decided that actually let's not go forward with the AI Act, it's not that somehow a few years from now this wonderful tech ecosystem would boom in Europe. I think there's at least 4 reasons that explain why the EU is behind the US, and they have very little to do with tech regulation. So let me pause. I think this is important to pause for a few moments to walk you through those reasons that I think are much more important. First, there is no integrated digital single market in the EU. It is very hard for tech companies to scale across the fragmented marketplace. That's not the problem for companies in the US, and that's not a problem for companies in China. The second, there is also no integrated, deep, robust capital markets in the EU. Capital markets are still very often national, and that makes fundraising much, much harder. So the European tech startups are doing really well in the first few funding rounds, but then when they need more capital, they need to turn to US venture capital. Often they are absorbed by leading US tech companies. Again, not the story about the GDPR. It's the story about whether you can fund your innovations. The third reason is punitive bankruptcy laws and attitudes towards risk-taking. The European countries have some of the most stringent bankruptcy laws that make it very difficult for entrepreneurs to have a second chance if they fail. Failure is often fatal in Europe, whereas here it seems to be like a rite of passage. You try very hard, you fail, and then we give you money again because it seems like you're working on big things. And that's not how the European mentality works. And the fourth is that you cannot be a leading innovator if you don't have innovators. And here again, the US has a massive advantage over Europe because it has been able to tap into the global talent pool, whereas the Europeans haven't had the same proactive approach towards immigration. So if you look at, for instance, over $1 billion startups in the US, over 50% have an immigrant founder. If we zoom in for a moment, just for the leading tech giants and their founders, so Steve Jobs of Apple, the son of a Syrian immigrant. Jeff Bezos of Amazon, second-generation Cuban. Elon Musk of Tesla, South African. Eduardo Saverin, the co-founder of Facebook, Brazilian. Sergey Brin, the co-founder of Google, Russian. There's a huge story of the American ability to take advantage of having the global talent come to the US, often through institutions like this, and stay and benefit the US job market. So again, the idea that if the US were to move towards the European rights-driven regulatory model, that wouldn't dismantle the US capital markets. That wouldn't prevent the immigrants from coming to the United States. That wouldn't rewrite the bankruptcy laws of this country and attitudes towards risk-taking. So here the broader argument is that the two models can coexist in the sense that the European rights-driven regulatory model could complement the existing benefits that the US has as a technological innovator. So let me now focus on what actually worries me much more about the European rights-driven model doing well. It's not that the Europeans are overdoing the regulation. It's that I think they are underdoing the regulation. They are not regulating enough, or at least they are not implementing, enforcing those regulations well enough. Europeans have been great at promulgating regulations, but the enforcement record has been quite patchy, including in the GDPR. We still have massive privacy violations all the time. The internet remains littered with disinformation and hate speech. And even though the EU has imposed over 10 billion of fines against Google, this market dominance remains pretty much unlocked. So I think what we would need to see is actual implementation of all those regulations that have been put in place. The third challenge is that the European model is doing very well in the democratic world, but it has very little appeal in the authoritarian and authoritarian-leaning world, and that world is getting bigger by the day. And I don't think the Europeans and Americans think about that enough. And there are many reasons why those countries are much more drawn to the Chinese state-driven model. They like what they see with the Chinese model. They don't want the rights of the European model. They don't want that democracy that those rules are designed to protect. So that is a huge challenge. And I give you a couple of reasons why it's a challenge that is very difficult for the EU and the US to overcome, to persuade those countries to turn their back to the Chinese model and rather follow a variant of the rights-driven model, or then the model that the US is potentially together with Europe in the future offering them. So one reason is that infrastructure power is fundamentally important for digital development of these countries. There are many countries in the world that cannot afford to turn down the infrastructure built by Chinese companies because it's often the only game in town or the only one that they can afford. For then the US and the EU to go and tell them, well, you may be surveilled by Beijing. There are many governments who say, look, that's not my primary concern. I can't afford to lead policy thinking about privacy in the mornings. I need digital development, and China is providing us a path to that development. The second issue, and this was something I was very uncomfortable writing in the book, but I felt that it is true and it needs to be there. China has shown to the world that freedom is not necessary for innovation. They have managed to create a thriving tech economy without being free, and contrary to what we told and believed. So in many ways, we cannot go and tell those countries, if you choose the Chinese model, you get control, but you will not see economic growth. You will not see innovation. They look at China and say, well, it seems that I can have both. And that's the way they like it. So here is one caveat, though. It's really interesting. I'm watching now what's happening in the generative AI space, and Chinese companies seem to be lagging behind the American companies. One challenge for Chinese firms is that they do have their censorship regime, and any generative AI needs to be consistent and not undermine that regime, which sets some constraints into training these models and how they operate. So there might be that we can still be vindicated in the view that I would like to believe is true, is that ultimately you do innovate more when you're free. But it's very hard to look at the track record of Chinese innovation and really adopt a strong form of the argument that the correlation is there between the political model we believe is right and the innovation outcomes that we are observing. Okay, so let me now move into, I'm eager to open this up to the sort of final remarks of the battle, of all the battles that I discussed, the battle that to me is the most important one, and it follows directly from what I said about China doing well. The ultimately most important battle is fought about the future of liberal democracy. And here I would want to emphasize that that battle can be lost in one of two ways. One is if the EU and US lose the horizontal battle to China, and the world is indeed turning more digital authoritarian. But liberal democracy can also be lost if the US and the EU lose the vertical battle to tech companies and ultimately don't find a way to govern the technology as opposed to just hand over that governance to the tech companies themselves. And here I have some serious concerns as well, because currently the US doesn't seem to be having a functional legislator to the extent that the US could even legislate in this space. China doesn't have a hard time legislating. The Europeans are good at legislating, but as I already mentioned, they are struggling to enforce those regulations. Again, if China decides that it's time to crack down on big tech, China will crack down on big tech. That's not how it works in Europe. And that's not how it works in the US. So the challenge for the US and the EU is to show that there is a liberal democratic way for our institutions to effectively govern technology. If that doesn't work out, we are forced to concede that digital economy is either governed by authoritarians, whereby democratic governments are failing in that same endeavor, or it is governed by tech companies. That is also not consistent with liberal democracy. So I guess my final invitation, my warning, my call to action, whatever you want to call it in the book, is that I do want us to make sure that we are not ultimately forced to conclude that the true digital empires are the authoritarians or the tech companies themselves. So let me leave it there. Thank you.
All right, I think you have to be over there for some reason.
All right.
I don't know. So. All right, that was wonderful. That was wonderful, and there's lots of food for thought there. And I'll start with a few questions. Those of you online should put your questions in the Q&A, and those of you in the room should raise your hands. Let me just start with the sort of where you ended, which is, all right, the Europeans have, this is a caricature, but fight me on it if necessary, that the Europeans have great laws, they just don't enforce them. All right, so that great, and the fact that they're not enforcing them is an indicator of something about the laws. But just if that is the problem, which is lack of enforcement of good laws, what explains that? Could it be that maybe they're worried that once the laws really need to take a bite, that that they're not as good as maybe they seem on paper?
So Nate, let me maybe say that it's not that I would say they don't enforce them. They're certainly trying to enforce them, but they're not quite enforcing them as effectively. And I think there are a couple of reasons for that. So one thing, this is a really difficult domain to enforce. You are fighting some big giants that are more resourceful, that are engaged in activity of the kind of scale and volume that is very difficult. It is an overwhelming task. So if you just think about the resource discrepancy. So when the GDPR entered into force, and the main enforcer in the EU basically became the Irish Data Protection Commission, because that's where the headquarters of the leading tech companies are. So the budget of the Irish Data Protection Agency, that year the GDPR entered into force, was I think 9 million, which is about the same that the US tech company's headquarters in Dublin make in every 10 minutes. So it is a really big task to try to regulate these companies. Then if you think about so there's this scattered, more fragmented enforcement structure that has left the leading regulators basically overwhelmed with the task. The other one is the remedies, that the Europeans have tried to do this by resorting to high fines. So 10 billion sounds like a lot of fines against Google, but ultimately these companies have been treating these fines as the price for doing business in Europe. And they pay these fines as long as they don't need to change their business model. And right now the Europeans are trying to reset this game, and these new regulations, the Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, are choosing now to pursue a different route. And they are designed to really target the heart of the business models of these companies, which is much costlier for these companies. So we will see if that will make the difference. And then as a final thing, Nate, I would mention that regulating is very hard when you are committed to rule of law and democracy. It is much messier, and why China has certain advantages, which does not lead me to conclude we should be like China. But we need to find out how do we do this within the confines of democratic rulemaking. Because if you think about regulating content online, it is much easier if you're an authoritarian and you pursue censorship. The Europeans are very committed to freedom of expression. And at the same time, they are very uncomfortable with hate speech that compromises dignity of individuals or leads to discrimination. So there are these multiple conflicting rights that you are trying to reconcile. And that means you can't have a blunt approach. The line drawing becomes much murkier, and hence I think just less clean to execute as such.
But I want to sort of press on whether the answers are so clear as to what the regulations should look like. Whether with established regulations like GDPR or emerging regulations like the AI Act. I mean, you see that one of the things that you said in your talk is that there's now a consensus that the libertarian American approach is not the right way to go. That might be true. So and even in the U.S., the problem is that while Republicans and Democrats both hate big tech, they hate them for different reasons, right? And so to say that, yeah, there's an emergent view that we should do something about these companies, sort of defaults back into, well, when literally the arguments are diametrically opposed from each other, it is the libertarian tradition which says, all right, all things being equal, we're going to defer to the private sector and let them hash it out because government just doesn't have the answers here.
Yeah, so partially I think it is the weakness, but it's also a strength of Europe, that there are these different opinions on what regulation ought to look like. Mm-hmm. And I think that is no secret when you have 27 member states that have different sort of historical, cultural, political traditions and somewhat different priors, is ultimately leads to regulation that is less extreme. So if you think about the Germans, given their historical experience with the privacy, or rather its absence, they are more absolutists when it comes to privacy protection. But then the French, for instance, that have recently experienced rather significant terrorist attacks, that are a military power, that are willing to elevate national security and law enforcement concerns to the center, they are not willing to go probably quite as far in privacy issues. The same thing that when it comes to AI, there's kind of the more pro-innovation camp, the technologically advanced member states that are making sure that the regulation is not too invasive, and then others that are willing to go much more all the way. So ultimately, I think often it does lead to the kind of back and forth whereby the regulations emanating from Brussels already reflect a compromise across the 27 countries, which means that they also are more susceptible for the Brussels effect. They can be implemented in other jurisdictions as well, because they are already sort of designed to respond to different preferences of different types of countries. But at the same time, there's no secret when you deal with Hungary and its lack of commitment to rule of law and democracy, of course, it hinders the EU's ability to have cohesive regulations designed to then foster democracy as such. So I think it works a little bit both ways.
Well, and so the fact that there might be broad agreement once you do the negotiation on larger principles, but maybe that is also part of the story about why enforcement is so lax, right? Which is that it's all well and good if you have these compromises at the supranational level, but when it comes down to enforcement, then there's real disagreements as to what the right way to do this is.
Yeah, which is why always one of the most consequential decisions for European regulators is that who should be enforcing this. Yeah. And there's more than one model. There's three primary models right now. One is the GDPR model, whereby the enforcement is done at the member state level. And that has been criticized, in particular because it was elevating Dublin to the position that many felt it couldn't handle. The other model is the antitrust model, that is also now the model with the Digital Markets Act, which means it's centralized. Brussels is in charge. So Commissioner Vestager is running the show. It's her show, it's the EU, and the member states are playing mainly a supporting role. And some say that's more robust when you have this sort of cohesive power of the European Commission. Of course, some member states say that sometimes it's important for us to have our sort of national priorities, so the more decentralized model is better. Then there's the DSA model, the Digital Services Act, where you basically have a bifurcated enforcement structure, whereby the smaller companies are handled by the member states and their enforcement institutions, whereas the largest companies, including those coming from the Valley primarily, the large ones are then dealt with by the Commission. So that's sometimes thought to be then a better way to do that.
We're getting lots of questions on Zoom. One from our colleague, Mark Lemley. I see Frank has his hand up. But I want to ask one last point here, which is whether certain kinds of technology, I'm thinking of AI right now, the technology is moving so quickly that the European model almost can't work, right? And that it's incredibly difficult to predict. I mean, take like the negotiations. Had the AI Act been passed a year and a half ago, there would have not been any provisions for generative AI, right? And then ChatGPT, is dropped on the world, and now that's all we're talking about. And so is it clear, do you think that the European model can really rein in what are the sort of emerging technologies that a lot of us are talking about?
So I think it's a really legitimate concern, Nate, and it's very hard for legislation to keep up with the fast-moving technology. But to me, I wouldn't conclude from that observation that, okay, well, then we just need to see the stage technology and be spectators and just let it run its own course. So yes, I think the AI Act is probably not out fast enough. I'm really concerned about this particular year with over 50 elections taking place around the world, and the AI Act is doing nothing to prevent or we can't do anything with the AI Act to prevent when AI is being used to amplify the existing problems around disinformation, distorting our reality, manipulating images and messages, and interfering potentially with electoral outcomes. So yes, in many ways it's too little too late. But at the same time, I go back to what I said earlier. It's very hard to imagine a democratic system to produce legislations much faster and expect them to be of better quality. So what you need to do is to draft legislation in the way that is more nimble and that can be amended. So with the AI Act, some issues have been pushed to annexes precisely because they are easier to amend. And I have no illusion that somehow we would not be continuing to revise this legislation. What I'm not sympathetic to was this view that, okay, this was too early for the Europeans to try to step in because AI was moving so fast. We really need to see first where this is heading. It's not that we're somehow done with AI next year or the year after that. So at some point you need to come in with as fast as you can without compromising the quality of deliberation, come up with the kind of design for legislation that can be revisited while making the trade-off that, look, it's less predictable if it's subject to revisions, but that's, I think, the only way that law can play a role.
I want to turn to Frank Fukuyama, and then I'm going to ask Mark Lemley's question, and I'll come back to the room. So, Frank, there's a microphone that's
Okay, thank you very much for that. It seems to me the distinctions you made between these different regulatory regimes is quite clear. It seems one big difference between the European and American approaches to regulation is that we rely very heavily on private right of action. My personal opinion is this is really crazy in many of the areas where it's done, but it does shift a lot of the burden of the resources of regulating to the private actors. And I wonder whether you have any reflections on that. I mean, when we think about regulating, we think first of all about modifying Section 230 and not, state action to actually enforce, which I think is kind of a big distraction, and it's prevented the United States from actually moving in a more European direction. But if you have any reflections on any of that.
No, thank you. I think it's absolutely sort of foundational and something I discussed already in the Brussels effect, that the Europeans have this view that it's an administrative state. There's ex-ante regulation. We cannot wait for the harm to materialize and then expect that retroactively we rely on private right of action, tort suits and so forth. But at the same time, the Europeans are conscious that there are certain efficiencies when you have an active bar and also you can harness the power of the private actors to help in the enforcement effort, especially because public enforcement, even the Europeans know, is often insufficient. Culturally, that has been a little bit harder. We don't have all those sort of foundational elements when it comes to class action lawsuits, the way you fund them, how fee shifting works, all those issues that make it sort of less attractive route in the EU. Another reason is that the procedural rules often and sort of legal institutions differ across the member states. So even if there's kind of harmonized, centralized substantive rule, the issues like private right of action is a part of the procedural autonomy often of the member states, and there are different approaches to how strong of a role it would play in the member states. Some member states reserving a very modest role for that. But the EU has tried to move a little bit more towards the American direction in some domains like antitrust. And we also see that also as an option to enforce, to complement the enforcement in the Digital Markets Act. So the private parties can also bring suits. When it comes to AI Act, there's also the ability then for private parties to bring complaints and then seek remedies in some instances, but I don't expect a robust private right of action to be a key enforcement philosophy. So I think it is really this idea that fundamentally the Europeans have more faith in government, in doing things on their behalf, including litigating issues on their behalf, enforcing laws on their behalf. Whereas in the US, this kind of personal autonomy and more individualistic way of thinking about the role of private litigants, I think is going to sustain some of those differences for quite a while still. But I think absolutely that's a central distinctive feature.
So let me just turn to Mark's question, though. He has several, but one is about challenging you on whether a splinter net is actually developing or not. And he says, China has essentially separated itself from the global internet, so has Russia. Brazil was well on its way to doing so before Bolsonaro lost, but I wonder if that's just the tip of the iceberg. Speaking of icebergs, we have that right behind us here. With the U.S. banning Chinese hardware, countries are increasingly forced to choose different hardware approaches, and that makes it much easier for different parts of the world to see different things, even on the supposedly global internet. What would be your response to that?
So first of all, I love Mark's work on the splinter net, and I think there are, in many ways, I think the truth is somewhere between. I recognize that already we partially have a splinter net. It is very true that China has effectively fenced its digital economy through effective censorship regime that is maintained by technological solutions and human sensors. The presence of a sort of absence of many US tech companies from the Chinese markets in that content space, I think is one evidence of that. I also completely concede that we are moving towards greater decoupling in many ways when we are witnessing the various sort of the technological decoupling and the export controls, investment restrictions, inbound, outbound, that are now taken mainly driven by national security concerns. But I think there's limits to how far we can go. So in the book that I mentioned, that there's the infrastructure that is very hard in many countries to completely sort of eradicate. The US is one of the few places that have been so aggressive in actually getting rid of Huawei and the players that have built those infrastructures. But there's a lot of path dependency in many countries where the Chinese presence is going to continue. At the same time, China can do this effectively, but I think in many places the US tech companies continue to have the presence, and they don't have the ability to shun off the US tech companies to the same extent. Fighting back the European regulation, I think, is only so successful. So there's going to be the kind of interconnections. But in particular, if we think about just the technological ecosystems, and if you look at something like semiconductors, it is such a costly, highly integrated ecosystem that there's no way that anybody can become technologically sovereign and sort of repatriate the entire complex supply chain to their own countries. And we know, if you look at how Apple is having a hard time really disentangling its manufacturing from China, it is trying to hedge and bring some of that to other parts of Asia. But to some extent, there are some cost advantages that means that Apple remains quite heavily vested in that market. So I think, Mark, ultimately we will see these pressures towards decoupling and pressures that resist that. So I think in the book I said that we are in this uncomfortable place between conflict and to some extent of uneasy cooperation, where we are sort of balancing the various political national security interests with very strong commercial interests that prevent the absolute full decoupling.
Let me actually go, we'll go Dave and then Divya in the back and then here and here, okay?
Hi, this was great, thank you. I wanted to sort of challenge a little the notion that the prevalence of particularly content harms is downstream of ineffective enforcement of good rules. We've talked a lot about innovation here around technology, but an equally important component of the innovation that our sort of American approach has engendered is around actual policing of those harms, right? Like, at least to me, and again, coming from industry, the bigger problem is that we're not terribly good yet at doing enforcement, and particularly for the sort of kind of nuanced democracy respecting rules that you're talking about. we're just not terribly good at nailing that sort of trade-off. And I am suspicious that there may not be a like perfect trade-off that actually makes the public happy. Whereas if you're China, you can just accept a lot of false positives and solve that problem by not caring about anybody's feedback. We may be in a world where our precision of enforcement simply isn't good enough. Have you, I don't, did it come up in the book? How do you think about that?
You know, I think it's a very good observation, because even if you kind of had a shared commitment on what you're trying to accomplish, let's say that the US and the EU both clearly agree that democracy is a good thing, even though there are some moments that, no, let's not go there. But anyway, so the idea that even if the US and the EU both want to maximize the online conversation so that we can restore and make democracies more robust, sometimes the US and the EU are implementing that goal differently, which leads them to pursue different content moderation rules. Sometimes the Europeans are asking for some content to be taken down in the name of protecting democracy, whereas the Americans invoke the very same rationale and insist that's why the content needs to stay up. So it is really like you said really well, that the line drawing is very unclear, even if you had a shared objective. Because there are many ways to think about what is the sort of the contribution of certain controversial content to democratic discourse, which I think is just sort of that does more justice to the complexity of how democracies operate and how should we understand democratic discourse. So I think that's very well, it's hard to imagine that we can ever come up with the kind of set of rules that we all believe that the content moderation would not have false positives and false negatives, which I think makes it very central then who is in a position to do that line drawing and how much transparency there is about that line drawing, so that we can at least have a democratically robust conversation of how that line is being drawn and whether that is right or wrong.
Hi, Professor Bradford. Thank you so much for your clear framing. My name is Divya. I'm an undergrad here, and I just spent a quarter in Berlin, so very excited to hear about your EU framing. I loved how you talked about the 3 different empires, and I'm wondering if you can talk about what the other relevant countries are that you would say are between empires and who we should be paying attention to.
Very good. So obviously there is more to the world than 3 empires, and I talk a lot about certain countries which are not in a position to really choose among the empires. They are at the mercy of the empires, depending of their political alliances, their trade relationships, whether they can actually say that they can afford to say that I don't take the Chinese infrastructure or so forth. But then there are other players that are more in a autonomous position to chart their digital destiny, and I would mention India. So if I had decided to spend another year with the book, I probably would have done more on India, and I'm particularly intrigued by the DPI, this digital public infrastructure, what they do, which is also an export now for India. So I think India is also a country that that has the kind of technological capabilities and has complex enough political relationships and economic relationships that it's not going to just be at the mercy of one empire. That in many ways India is kind of picking and choosing some elements of the existing empire. So India has a privacy law that is very similar to the GDPR, but then it has very strong data localization principles that seems to be very much drawn from the Chinese model. So that is also seems to be that it's kind of a hybrid model that reflects its distinct preferences. So I think that's one thing that at least I would highlight, and some other countries too, especially when we then talk about this kind of the world divided between techno-autocracies and techno-democracies. It's not a binary concept. There are many countries that straddle the two and quite sort of selectively collaborate or emulate parts of what China does, parts of what Europe does. Singapore, I would think about as somebody that has elements of all 3 quite strongly. So there are certain almost like authoritarian tendencies. Content moderation space is not exactly sort of free speech driven. At the same time, there is certain sort of independent regulatory capacity to adopt quite sophisticated variants of the EU regulation, but also very strong market instincts. Japan, I think, falls pretty interestingly between the market-driven model and the rights-driven model. Often emulating very closely the wording of European regulations in AI and privacy. But then it is a culture where there is a lot of defaulting to voluntary rules. And I recently, when I was in Tokyo, people say, well, people here follow rules, so they don't need to be always mandatory. So we always believe that you can actually have guidelines and recommendations, but the companies take them seriously. My question to them was, well, will the US tech companies take them seriously if they are just voluntary frameworks that you offer? But I think that's one way I would place Japan kind of between the two models, India to some extent between the multiple models too.
So these two, okay, right here and then.
Thank you. Professor Bradford. My name is Sandeep. I'm a Master of International Policy student here. Full disclosure, conflict of interest for this question. I was also at Meta for the last 3 years working on global elections, security, and DSA compliance, which is not fun the first year. But in everything you've been talking about, a question comes up based on my experience and on this is a question of the underlying premise for each of these three regimes on the parity between a person's online behavior and online identity versus their offline behavior and offline identity. Frank talked about right of action for private right of action for enforcement. We put that onus on private citizens to enforce. But how do you view each of these countries, and I'll give examples, seeing their private citizens demanding safety on these platforms without taking responsibility for the harms that they themselves put on these platforms? I'm not saying, and again, I fully recognize if we live in China's regime, you say something bad about, bring up Tiananmen Square, a few CC AI face recognitions, a few WeChat attributions, the MSS comes and grabs you, and you are, like, there's a very clear, your online behavior is tied to your offline persona. In Europe and Germany, you mentioned the contradiction between privacy, demanding privacy, absolute privacy, but also demanding hate speech be taken off. I can say from experience, Germany also likes that hate speech be removed globally for everyone around the world. Seems a little bit overreaching, but there was never a conversation about who in Germany is part of a neo-Nazi group or part of a disinformation or misinformation producing group. And I'm curious, in your understanding of each of these regimes of regulation as they relate to tech companies, is there space for understanding the entire offline and online ecosystem and a full identity of a person as a participant, especially in democracy? I'm losing breath. Especially in a democracy that involves their enforcement and their actions that create this harm. Sorry.
Well, if I tell me if I don't sort of answer the question directly, but I think there has been a lot of recognition, including in the EU, that media literacy is something that also, we think about the supply and demand side here, that is also important. We can, partially for the reasons that we just discussed, that the content moderation done through these algorithms is not going to be perfect. We are not going to eradicate all disinformation. So one question is, how do we then empower the users not just to ask more from platforms, but to be just more informed consumers so that they will flag, first of all, when there's a problem, but they also have their own filters, which means that they are more responsible in terms of the content they post, the content they consume, and the content they forward, the content they engage with. So there's been a lot of kind of media literacy and other initiatives that are trying to create the kind of culture whereby the users are also more responsible. But I think there is still the sense that trying to effectuate a change, one user at a time, is a very slow process, especially when there's an acknowledgement that there's addiction, there's the way that these algorithms are built that sometimes distort the individual's free will and choice and ability to make those good decisions. And the individual's ability to anymore tell fiction and fantasy from reality is not even at the level that we can expect them to sort of exercise their agency to the same way. Obviously, this conversation is very different in the Chinese context. And that's where there is this idea. But I also, when I teach these classes, and I do have some of my Chinese students who say that they take a lot of comfort in the idea of having the safer government-managed information environment so that they are not facing some of that. This is not what all my Chinese students say at all, but there is also, when they explain how Chinese citizens generally think about this regulation. Many of them say that they do think that there is trust in surveillance technologies. It is safer to walk on the streets when you know that there are cameras. So there's not necessarily the same kind of sense of values or attachment to personal privacy, that sometimes you accept much more of those decisions being made for you by somebody else, as opposed to trying to maximize individual agency. So I think that's again something where the US and the EU and China to some extent are different. But of course there are differences within the individual nations too.
Hi, thanks for giving the talk. So I'm from Europe. I don't have a lot of in-depth knowledge about this area, but I had to nod a lot while you were talking because I made the same experiences. So please do correct me if I will just tell about how I experience things, especially when living there. One thing I wanted to ask you about is education. So basically we talked about that a lot of these laws cannot really be executed because, and at least in Germany, where I'm from, this is a huge problem. We don't even have the digital infrastructure or the people well versed enough to understand what the law is even saying. So even if there's a certain law and the police are still using fax, there's no way for them to even go online because the police station has no Wi-Fi. I'm not making this up. This was last year. This is just not enforceable. And while in Europe we have sometimes more regulations, this also means that we're moving forward a bit slower. And I'm wrapping up. So basically, we didn't have computer science teachers, and we still don't have computer science teachers because there are no teachers to educate computer science teachers. So during the pandemic, students didn't got any education, basically. We see that in the newest PISA study. Whereas I feel in the US, people are a bit quicker to offer computer science lessons in schools and so on. So how do we get out what I perceive, maybe it's not the case, out of this deadlock of not being able to enforce these regulations without people who know tech?
So I think you already outline, I think, very excellent ideas that it starts from, if you think about that you want to have more informed, capable digital citizens. It needs to start from education at schools and the right resources. But then it goes all the way to the level of those who are writing the rules and enforcing the rules. And now one big challenge for the European Commission is that if it's going to effectively enforce the Digital Services Act, for instance, it needs a lot more data scientists, that it can actually take advantage of these transparency provisions. That's why one of my favorite provisions of the DSA is that we give access to researchers as well to these algorithms, so that we can bring more transparency and have these other communities that can assist in the enforcement by really uncovering and unveiling those different content moderation practices. So I don't think it can be just the Commission that has the task, but really to have the broader research community also contribute to our understanding what is happening.
But I think your microphone might. One last question from Daphne, and then we're going to have to end.
This is super wonky. I don't think we can really get through it. But so I'm interested in how exportable you think important European laws are to the rest of the world. I think a lot of us look to the GDPR as a model, but of course the GDPR has economic mechanisms to favor adoption of similar laws by other countries for data transfer and adequacy determinations. It has that recurring meeting with the global privacy regulators. I checked, the next one's in Bahamas, and they all, and compliance is largely invisible, so you can have regulations and declare that they're a success when who knows what's actually happening. And the DSA, by contrast, it's such very detailed, very public compliance, and there isn't this baseline similarity in other countries. So I'm curious how exportable you think other important regulations are, and whether the GDPR is a viable model or is just really distinct.
So to some extent, I think they are exportable for the reason that I mentioned to Nate, that they are designed not just to work in one jurisdiction. They are a reflection of a compromise. Then there are some really pragmatic reasons why the European laws work really well for exportation. And I tell you one that sounds very basic, but it's actually true. they exist in all these different languages. So if you are in Francophone Africa, if you are in Latin America, you have your off-the-shelf stuff in French, in Portuguese, in Spanish. All the judgments, all the supporting documents, all the guidance is also available in the language. That makes it very easy to copy as well. So there, and the conversations can be had in the languages when you reach out to people at the Commission who come and train you. They can do it in Spanish, they do it in Portuguese, they do it in French, and they teach you through that with those documents. And the idea that that's very detailed, that often makes it easier. Trying to export US antitrust law and Sherman Act with its couple of sentences and then tell, well, study the case law to figure out how this works, it's much harder. Whereas when you have the kind of statutory culture that gives you the very precise rules, it is sometimes easier for countries that don't have the technical capacity to copy them. That said, they often then end up with too precise legislations that may be not fully fitted for their own jurisdictions. But the ones that now seem to be sort of moving towards emulating the EU are the ones that are more capable jurisdictions that can also pick and choose, like Australia and Canada, South Korea, Japan, that we don't expect them to have a wholesale importation. And I think that's probably where I see the greatest potential. So first of all, Europe creates the kind of momentum that they can now go to their legislators and say, look, Europe is doing this can be done. The same thing with the AI Act. We have now a template of a credible legislator actually pushing through the regulation. You take their text and you say that maybe there's something that is well thought through that works with us as well. But I think ideally you then see this may not work with us, this may work, and you will tailor it more to the needs of the country. But ultimately, I see sort of both advantages and disadvantages with this exportation, but partially it is just at the many levels that it happens, and partially it is also creating the political economy momentum in different countries. Now that Facebook and Instagram can no longer exploit European minors with targeted advertising, it is harder for them to justify continuing that conduct here. And that may just give the kind of impetus for different legislative initiatives, which is then indirectly still the result of the European efforts, even if it doesn't lead to direct copying of that law.
Well, thank you very much. Please join me in thanking Bradford.
Thank you. Thanks.
Next week we have Jeff Horowitz from the Wall Street Journal. He's the one who he wrote a book and wrote that series of articles about the Frances Haugen revelations. He was the journalist who was there. But pick up Digital Empires, at a bookstore near you if they still exist. And we'll see you next week. Thank you again.
Thank you, Nate. Thank you.
I thought that was great.